Hello and welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. Boris Yeltsin, was he a great man who made history, or was he merely a product of his time? Opinions differ widely, though no one denies the important role he played in creating our present. CrossTalk continues its series on the collapse of the Soviet Union 20 years ago. To CrossTalk Yeltsin's Russia, I'm joined by Dmitry Babich here in the studio with me. He's a political analyst at RIA Novosti news agency. In Washington, we have Donald Jensen. He's a resident fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations. And in London, we go to Alex Pravda. He is director of Russian and Eurasian Studies Center at the University of Oxford. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Well, the reason why we're doing this, we're doing a series here on CrossTalk on the collapse of the Soviet Union 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, on June 12, 1991, Yeltsin became the first popularly elected president of the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, basically the beginning of the demise of the Soviet Union that would follow later in the year. Dmitry Babich, let's look at that time 20 years ago and how the Soviet Union unraveled. How much was Yeltsin involved with that unraveling of the Soviet Union? People talk a lot about Gorbachev, but what about Yeltsin at this time?
Well, I think there were two parallel processes going on, which should not be mixed up. There was the process of democratization, and I think it was Yeltsin's star hour. For the first time in Russian history, a man came to power via honest election against the will of the government. That was an achievement. As for the collapse of the Soviet Union, it had begun long before that. It speeded up back in 1989. Already there was a lot of talk about it. And by 1991, the process was almost complete. I would remind you that in March, 2 months before the election, 7 republics out of 15 did not take part in the referendum on the reform of the Soviet Union. So the process has already gone very, very much forward. And Yeltsin, of course, when the Soviet Union was just virtually collapsing in summer 1991, he didn't shed tears. He started building the Russian Federation, the new state.
Let's stay at that point. Don, if I can go to you in Washington, from a Russian perspective in 2011, that was the good Yeltsin, okay? The Yeltsin that did the right thing, okay? Because right now in 2011, most people in this country are very pleased that the Soviet Union is gone. There's still a small minority that regret it, but Yeltsin was seen as a great banner to bring the end of a system that wasn't working for the people anymore. So Yeltsin, 20 years ago, what kind of character do you assess him to be?
I assess him, looking back, a very contradictory figure. I would almost say heroic, but certainly someone who displayed tremendous political courage. And I would note in passing that I agree with Dima's comments, and Yeltsin was ahead of even the U.S. government, many outside observers, in moving forward, where a lot of people, and most notably the first President Bush, seemed to indicate they wanted to preserve the Soviet Union, albeit in a more reformed way. But you ask about Yeltsin, I think he was in many ways one of the most politically courageous people I've ever been around, and I was in Moscow at the time as a diplomat, but also he was a tremendously contradictory figure whose career has to be separated into a number of phases, not all of which he performed admirably.
Alex, and if I can go to you in London, let's speed it up a little bit. Let's have Mr. Yeltsin as president of Russia, the first president of Russia. How do you see the beginning of his reform process? Because this is where people start disliking Yeltsin then, and very much, to some extent, hating him today. I'm talking about the liberalization of the economy.
Yeah, before I come to that, can I just say that I agree absolutely with the fact that he's a larger-than-life, historical leader who has huge pluses and huge minuses. And this goes with his economic reform program as well. You remember that in 1999, when handing over to Putin, Yeltsin reflected on his own contribution to Russia. And he started by saying, of course, the great achievement was we broke with communism, broke, as you just wanted to know, the command economy in two, broke into a liberal market capitalism. But then he added an apology, and he apologized for the fact that he was, along with others, so naive to think they could do it all in one big breakthrough.
Exactly.
Breakthrough politically, breakthrough economically, breakthrough socially. And if you break through, you break things. And ended up with a lot of inequality, a lot of corruption, a lot of the things that Yeltsin I don't think would have wanted. I remember meeting him in the 2000s, and he sincerely came over as someone who was a big populist leader concerned with people's welfare, and he reflected that it was a shame there were so many poor people still in Russia after all he had tried to do. So the economic change was necessary. Whether it could be done in one big leap or whether it would have been better done in small stages is a very, very big question.
Dima, what do you think about that in the studio here? More ideologically driven, theory driven in the early years? Because, as Alex just pointed out, I mean, and a lot of people know, is that the Russian economy contracted 50% at one point during his administration. And I'd like to point out to my audience here, the Great Depression in the United States, the U.S. economy contracted 25%. So if we can put that magnitude out there.
Well, I think Yeltsin was not an ideological president. And if you listen to his speeches, if you read his speeches now, he never said the word capitalism or the word socialism. That was not quite his style. I mean, I remember him saying in one of his interviews back in the 80s that people are tired of ideology. People just wanted to live better, and they wanted more economic freedom. And he gave them economic freedom in 1991, 1992. The problem was that, of course, people were poor, and the only ones who were rich and influential were criminals, yep, or some former party bosses. So obviously they benefited from this privatization more than an average Russian. But unfortunately, I think it was a global tendency. If we look, the world was tremendously unjust during all of the 90s, and it continues to be unjust now. It's built on some really wrong premises, which have little to do with real liberalism and with real capitalism, the way it was thought by Locke or by Hobbes in the 17th, 18th century.
Well, there'd be some people that say that Yeltsin and the Russians around him took the idea of a market economy too seriously, because you got rid of, you privatized the family jewels that actually created wealth in this country, and the rest of it just fell apart. I mean, and in the process, if I can go to you, Don, on this one, one of the biggest criticisms to this day is the creation of oligarchs that controlled so much of the economy, and this is exactly the inequality that Dima here was talking about, and it still plagues this country today. There's still a concentration of wealth in this country, and it comes from Yeltsin's era.
I very much agree. I think that if he and others have talked more about strengthening the rule of law, I think Russians probably would be a lot happier today about what happened in the 90s and might even be wealthier today. Just to go back to a point that Dima and Alex said, which I agree with, which is whether he was a man motivated by ideology. I think in many ways he was motivated by instinct. We used to sit around Moscow and say, well, he was a Democrat, he's a Democrat, but he doesn't really know what it means. And we'd watch this tremendous churning in society, and it was very difficult to understand sometimes what Yeltsin did or thought he was doing, particularly after '91, when you had to build a state. And this weakness of institutions, this weakness in the rule of law, I think is something where I would fault him very seriously.
Alex, what do you think about that? Because that's very interesting, is because in the 2000s, the argument was made that the state had to restructure, the government had to restructure the state because Yeltsin had allowed it to deteriorate so badly and have so much of the economy captured into private hands. I mean, this is one of the things that went wrong, and maybe not intentionally, but I mean, eventually the Russian state was no longer serving the purposes of what it was supposed to do, and this is the legacy of that follows Yeltsin to this day.
Right. I mean, I think two things come out of that. One is that Yeltsin came out of a heavily state apparatus-dominated system, the communist system. He reacted against that, wanted to give people the freedom, the liberty to be creative and make society themselves. But I disagree a bit with, I think, Dmitry about no ideology. No explicit ideology, but a culture of seeking panaceas, believing that there are solutions out there which will fix things within maybe 5 or 10 years. And that's part of a sort of Russian cultural heritage, seeking Marxism, combining it with Russian characteristics, then Yeltsin seeking broad-based capitalism, giving people like Gaidar free rule, reign, giving Chubais, handing out, and believing, it's a belief that if you allow people the opportunity to be entrepreneurs, to grab the assets, to make things work, that everything somehow will be positive-sum game. And that wasn't the case. And therefore, you don't need the state. You don't need to regularize, redistribute, manage in the old command system. So it was a typical pendulum swing from over-command, over-statification to under-statification, if you want, and an undermining of institutions and a free-for-all. And liberty, as we know, has enormous costs for most people who haven't got the energy to fight for their rights.
Let me ask Dima this. I mean, that's another accusation made against Yeltsin, is he was such a pendulum person. He would go to such extremes if it was on the democracy issue, the economy issue, defense, security. I mean, at first he embraced the West, but by the end, when we look at the Kosovo experience, Yeltsin felt that he had been betrayed by the West. But that was that pendulum.
I don't agree with this, because it was not Yeltsin, it was the West that changed its attitude to Russia. In 1991, the West was applauding Russia, and unfortunately, the country was collapsing. And then, in the end of the 90s, when Russia tried to say something, the West suddenly became very critical. So it was not Yeltsin who changed, it was the attitude of the West that changed. As for him, I think there were again two very distinct processes. Yeltsin was a Democrat in the early 90s. By the end of the 90s, he was a different person, talking about a political system. It became very difficult to access him, much more difficult than to access Gorbachev in the end of 80s. There were all kinds of weird people around him who had absolutely no legitimacy, including Anatoly Chubais, who was never elected by anyone. So basically, people, when they made demonstrations in support of Yeltsin in 1991, what they wanted was kind of a social democratic populist.
I want to go back to this point after the break. After that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the legacy of Boris Yeltsin. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin. But first, here's a brief report on Yeltsin's contentious legacy.
In recent Russian history, few personalities remain as polarizing as Boris Yeltsin. 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin is still seen in the West as the politician who ended communism and ushered in a new era of personal freedoms and Western-style capitalism.
Anything large is better perceived from a distance, especially in history. I think we still need more time for the emotions and troubles to give way to serious analysis of what a titanic figure Yeltsin really was.
In a moment that later became one of Russia's most iconic, Yeltsin, with genuine popular support, helped to stare down an attempted coup in 1991.
Thus we declare illegal all the decrees and decisions by the State Emergency Committee.
In the US and in the Western world, Yeltsin was seen as a reformer and a leader who could compromise. He was embraced as a friend and told he was treated as a peer. And when he died in 2007, some of the warmest eulogies came from Western leaders.
He stood up for freedom and democracy and openness. He really believed that Russia couldn't go back to communism or back further to extreme nationalism.
Praise from abroad, yes. But Yeltsin's sharpest critics were in the new country that he helped bring into being, Russia. In theory, Yeltsin supported a market economy, but the reality was Western-inspired shock therapy and crony capitalism. Russia's economy went to a free fall, and the Russian ruble had to be devalued twice during his time in office. For millions of Russians, this was yet another time of troubles. Yeltsin played a critical role in ending communist rule, though as president, he ordered the army to attack a mutinous parliament. He then rammed through constitutional reforms that extended his powers as president at the expense of parliament. And few can forget the brutality of the first Chechen conflict. By the end of his presidency, Yeltsin, like so many Russians at the time, became wary of the West.
I told NATO, the Americans, the Germans, don't push us toward military action. Otherwise there will be a European war for sure, and possibly world war.
There's no doubt that Boris Yeltsin is an outstanding historical figure. though it may take decades for the Russians themselves to find a consensus about a name that changed Russian and world history forever. Masha Charnay for CrossTalk RT.
Okay, Alex, I'd like to go back to you in London. Dima Babic in the studio brought up a very interesting point about how Russia looked at the West and the West looked at Russia during Yeltsin's tenure. How do you assess that? I mean, was there a pendulum there? Were there misperceptions on one side or both sides?
I think there were misperceptions on both sides. Russia expected the West to applaud the end of communism, the introduction of a post-communist, purportedly democratic regime, and it expected the West to give lots of money to support that regime and to stabilize the transition to market democracy. But the West responded to Russia's self-liberation by appearing to be fairly mean. It wasn't the best of economic conditions. The big Marshall Plan #2, as it were, didn't come about, and Russia became more and more disillusioned about real partnership with the West. But the trouble with Russian foreign policy, we went back to that before in the discussion, is that rhetorically there was a lot of protest about NATO expansion, NATO militarism, and European lack of friendliness. But in actual fact, the actions were pro-Western until the late 1990s. It was the combination of the bombing of Kosovo and preceding that the economic crisis, the banking crisis and the crash that brought about a real disillusionment, not just with the West among the leaders of Russia, but also among the new liberal middle classes.
Don, I don't know what years you were a diplomat in the 1990s in Russia, but what did you see? I mean, were the Russians expecting too much from the West, or the West just thought, well, the Cold War is over, we won. I mean, they'll find their way. The IMF, and this, have a liberal economic system, and everything will just be this Jim Dandy. But we know it wasn't. I mean, what were the perceptions and misperceptions during your tenure here?
Well, there were a lot of misperceptions. Okay. I wanted to say that first, that I agree with Alex that Yeltsin changed, the West changed, but I would also say that Russia changed. I think the West expected a kind of a breakthrough to a larger version of maybe what Poland or the Czech Republic is today, and that simply was never, in retrospect, going to be the case. Second, the West, I think it's important to recall, the West championed the 1993 constitutional reforms that gave a much stronger presidency to Yeltsin than had existed before, and as a consequence, to some extent, we abetted what we now criticize as a super presidential regime. But I wanted to go back to 91, and I think that there's a lot of misperception about what happened in 91, whereas I and many others thought it was a democratic breakthrough. I think there were a lot of impulses there, populism, anti-Sovietism, and frankly, Russian nationalism, that in a moderate form, which blended together with the so-called pro-democratic forces. So 91, I think, was misinterpreted, and then once that was misinterpreted, a lot of what we saw go on out in the following decade was, I think, underestimated and misinterpreted as well.
Dima, it's very interesting, is because do you think, in retrospect, that the West wanted Russia to just reinvent itself in a Western image? Because that's what it sounds like when you go back. And because it's the triumphantism of winning the Cold War, and Russia looks at it in a very different way. It collapsed the Soviet Union itself. It wanted something different. It wasn't a defeat. But Russia is still, even in mainstream media, still treated as a defeated power.
Well, I think that's the problem. Russia was treated as a defeated power, and in that sense, the West has shown a lack of fantasy. I think it characterizes the whole period of the 90s. Lack of fantasy. The West could not invent a new Russia, an allied state or even a neutral state. It returned to the old ways of treating Russia with suspicion, which is just usual, this was nothing new. As for 1991, I can tell you, that in July 1991, an American government delegation came to Russia, and they came to Vladimir Ryzhkov, who was the head of the Soviet government, and they said, "We stake on you. We don't believe these Democrats. We think you're a serious person." Few people remember that, but that's not the case. Remember. And I think it shows you the lack of fantasy at the time.
Okay, Alex, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, and lack of fantasy, yeah, but it's very difficult to get this around, make sense of this. Russia wanted to be treated in the early 1990s both as a co-victor a victor against communism, so self-imposed victory, and therefore be treated as a partner, and also to be given this kind of economic aid which would be expected of a defeated power in a virtual war. So at one and the same time, they wanted to be treated as equal victors and also to be bailed out and helped out to recover as defeated powers. And that was a very difficult pair of conceptions to get people's minds around in the West.
Don, what do you think about that? That's a very interesting paradigm. Very interesting paradigm. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I should tell Dmitry that I did not write those comments, so I was in the embassy at the time. I think I very much agree with Alex, and frankly, and I know what the perception in Russia is as being treated like a defeated power. Certainly, I think in policymaking circles in Washington, that was not the case, even if it maybe appeared that way to people in Russia. They basically thought that Russia would end up relatively quickly, I think, being like us, and that would, and thus a lot of the trouble that happened in the following decade, at least for some people in Washington, was to some extent a surprise. The second point I would make is that Russia itself, then and now, was ambivalent about the Soviet past, about its own past, and that made it much more difficult to craft a policy in one way or the other, politically or economically, to move Russia in the way we wanted it to go, and the fact that because Russians themselves were uncertain about which way they wanted to go.
Dmitry, I mean, when we look at in retrospect now, after his presidency, was it a missed opportunity? I mean, was Yeltsin really wanting to be a partner of the West, and it just wasn't simply embraced?
I think he wanted to be a partner of the West, and I think it's very unfortunate what happened. There was a lot of missed opportunities. You know, mountains were moving in Russia, and Americans and the Europeans just didn't recognize that mountains were moving. They didn't believe it. And when they finally believed it, Russian lava started to set in, you know, the mountains stopped moving.
Well, you know, but I think it's very interesting. I mean, all the gentlemen, when we look at the 1996 presidential election, I mean, it was amazingly fraudulent, but everybody in the West wanted to ignore all of the fraud. He won re-election, okay? We don't know exactly. I mean, I haven't gone back and done the empirical evidence myself, but I mean, just supporting him and not what he was trying to do, the democratization of this country, its economic reforms. They just wanted to base everything on Yeltsin, hoping that he would do the right thing. What do you think about that, Alex? Not a systemic change, but putting it on a person.
Yeah, well, first of all, leaders of states always want stability, first and foremost, because stability equals security for them. So Yeltsin was a symbol of some degree of stabilization and stability. That's why they backed him. But they did lack, in the early 90s, imagination. We mentioned lack of imagination before, but the biggest lack of imagination was on the international stage. Right. Had there been an imaginative sitting down with Russia at that time and said, let's redraw the European security system, let's end an expansion of NATO for inertial, bureaucratic, safety-first reasons, and let's look at the ways in which we can structure Russia in on an equal founding basis. Russia always wanted to be a founder member of something new rather than an adjunct junior member of something old. That was an opportunity missed, and by 1995-96 that had almost gone because NATO had started expanding. So Russia was let down in that way from a lack of imagination. At the same time, Russia let itself down by not having a unified strategy of any kind. The voices coming out of Moscow, Yeltsin said one thing, remember we went to Warsaw and said Poland could join NATO if it wanted. Then they reneged on that second time around. There were several voices, and the most important voices among them were the corporate voices who were pro-Western economic links and so on.
Okay, Alex, I'm going to have to jump in here, gentlemen. We've run out of time, and we certainly can all agree that Yeltsin led a revolutionary life. Many thanks to my guests today in the studio here with me in London and in Washington. Thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.